She adored him. He was her sunshine. I was just another one. But when she sold the house to help him, he just disappeared. And I stayed by her side. I always knew my place in the family hierarchy. It wasn't something anyone ever sat me down and explained. You just absorbed these things through 1,000 tiny moments over the years. The way her face lit up when he walked into her room. The way she'd tell her friends about his latest accomplishments while I sat there invisible at the kitchen table. The way his school events got circled in red on the calendar while mine got penciled in and sometimes forgotten. My brother had this magnetism that I never understood. People gravitated toward him at parties. Teachers remembered his name years after he graduated, and girls would call the house just hoping to catch a few minutes of his attention. He was 3 years older than me, and those 3 years might as well have been 3 decades for all the difference it made in how we moved through the world. Mom would light up whenever he called home from college. She'd drop everything, literally put down whatever she was doing mid-task, and settle in for these hour-long conversations where she'd laugh at his stories and ask detailed questions about his classes, his friends, his weekend plans. When I called from my dorm room, the conversations lasted maybe 10 minutes and felt like I was checking items off a list. How are classes? Fine. Do you need anything? No. Okay, well, study hard. After college, he moved back home for what was supposed to be a few months while he figured things out. Those few months stretched into 2 years. I'd come home for holidays and find him sprawled on the couch in the middle of the afternoon, playing video games or scrolling through his phone while Mom bustled around making his favorite meals and doing his laundry. She never asked him to contribute to household expenses or even clean up after himself. When I mentioned getting a job myself during summer break in high school, she'd launch into lectures about responsibility and the value of hard work. When he was unemployed at 25, she called it taking time to find his passion. The business idea came up during Christmas dinner 3 years ago. He'd been talking about entrepreneurship for months, throwing around buzzwords about disruption and innovation that sounded impressive but never seemed to connect to any actual plan. That night, though, he had specifics. He'd found this opportunity in import-export, had connections who could help him get started, just needed some initial capital to get the ball rolling. I watched Mom's eyes get that familiar shine they always got when he talked about his dreams. She started asking questions, not skeptical ones, but the kind that helped him elaborate and sound even more convincing. What kind of products? How did he learn about this opportunity? How much would he need to get started? The number he threw out made me choke on my mashed potatoes. It wasn't just significant money, it was life-changing money. The kind of sum that represented years of careful saving and sacrifice. I tried to catch Mom's eye across the table, but she was completely focused on him, nodding along as he painted pictures of the success that was surely just around the corner. After dinner, I pulled her aside in the kitchen while he was outside smoking. I tried to be gentle about it, but I had to say something. The whole thing felt rushed, vague, too good to be true. Maybe he could start smaller, test the waters, prove the concept before asking for such a massive investment. She got that defensive tone she always used when anyone questioned him. He'd done his research, she said. He wasn't a child anymore. He deserved a chance to build something for himself. And besides, what was money for if not to help your children achieve their dreams? I wanted to point out that she'd never asked me about my dreams, never offered to fund my ambitions, but that felt petty. Instead, I tried a different approach. What if something went wrong? What if the business didn't work out? This wasn't just her discretionary savings. This was her security, her retirement, her safety net. That's when he came back inside and caught the tail end of our conversation. The look he gave me was one I'd seen countless times growing up, a mixture of annoyance and condescension that made me feel about 6 years old. He said I was being negative, that I'd always been jealous of his opportunities, that maybe if I took some risks in my own life instead of playing it safe all the time, I'd understand what he was trying to accomplish. Mom immediately jumped to his defense, telling me that I should be supporting my brother instead of trying to hold him back. The conversation ended there, but I could see I'd already lost. The decision had been made before I'd even opened my mouth. Over the next few weeks, I watched the process unfold with a growing sense of dread. Real estate agents coming by to assess the house. Mom sorting through decades of belongings, deciding what to keep and what to sell. She'd lived in that house for 30 years, raised both of us there, built a life there. But she talked about selling it like it was just another financial instrument, a way to unlock the capital her son needed to succeed. The house sold faster than expected. The market was hot, and Mom's place was in a desirable neighborhood with good schools and mature trees. She got asking price within a week of listing. I helped her pack, spending long afternoons wrapping dishes in newspaper and taping up boxes of photo albums and holiday decorations. She moved into a small apartment across town, not in a bad area, but definitely a step down from the spacious house with the big backyard where she'd hosted every family gathering for decades. She seemed energetic about it, though, calling it a new chapter and talking about how freeing it was to downsize and simplify. The money transfer happened on a Tuesday. I know because she called me that evening, excited and nervous, to tell me it was done. He'd been so grateful, she said. So appreciative of her faith in him. He was flying out the next week to meet with his business partners and get everything set up. For the first few weeks after he left, we talked regularly. He'd call Mom every few days with updates about meetings and negotiations and promising developments. The details were always vague, but his enthusiasm was infectious, and Mom would relay every conversation to me with this pride in her voice that I'd rarely heard directed toward anything I'd ever done. Then the calls started getting less frequent. A week would go by, then 2 weeks. When Mom would reach out to him, he'd respond eventually, but with short texts about being busy with work stuff and promising to call soon. Soon stretched into weeks, and weeks stretched into over a month of silence. I started checking his social media obsessively. For the first time in years, he was posting regularly photos from beaches and restaurants and hotel pools. Pictures with people I didn't recognize, including a woman who appeared in multiple posts and seemed to be more than just a friend. The locations were tagged in Mexico, which didn't necessarily mean anything suspicious. Maybe his business really did require him to be there. Maybe he was just mixing business with pleasure. But something felt wrong. The timing was too convenient, the silence too complete, the lifestyle in the photos too lavish for someone who was supposed to be grinding to get a new business off the ground. Mom was trying to hide her worry, but I can see it eating at her. She'd mention him casually in conversation, wondering aloud when he might call or whether his business meetings were going well. She'd check her phone constantly, and I caught her scrolling through his old text messages more than once. Update 1. 2 months after the last phone call, I decided to do some digging. I'm not proud of what came next, but desperation makes you do things you wouldn't normally consider. I'd always been good with computers, and I still remembered some of his old passwords from when we were younger. People don't change their passwords as often as they should. What I found made my stomach drop. His email accounts painted a picture that was completely different from the story he'd told Mom. There were no business partners, no import-export opportunities, no meetings or negotiations. Instead, there were travel confirmations for flights to Cancun, hotel reservations at luxury resorts, and receipts for expenses that added up to more money than most people spend in a year. The worst part was a series of emails with someone who seemed to be helping him set up a new life down there. They were discussing apartment rentals, ways to transfer and convert money without triggering reporting requirements, and even how to establish residency. This wasn't a business trip that had gotten extended. This was a permanent relocation funded by Mom's life savings. I printed everything out and sat with it for 3 days, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that there was some explanation I was missing. Maybe the business was real but required him to relocate. Maybe he was planning to bring Mom down there once he got established. Maybe those emails were taken out of context. But deep down, I knew what I was looking at. He'd taken Mom's money and disappeared. He'd traded her security for his freedom, and he'd done it without a second thought. Telling Mom was the hardest conversation I've ever had to have. I drove to her apartment with the printed emails in a folder, rehearsing different ways to break the news gently. But there's no gentle way to tell someone that their favorite child has betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible. I started by showing her the social media posts, the beaches, the parties, the obvious vacation lifestyle. She tried to rationalize it at first, saying that business trips could include some leisure time, that successful people often mixed work and pleasure. But when I showed her the emails, her face went completely white. She read through them slowly, her hands shaking slightly. I watched 30 years of unconditional love and faith crumble in real time. When she finished, she just sat there in silence for what felt like hours. Then she started crying, not the dramatic sobbing you see in movies, but this quiet, heartbroken weeping that was somehow much worse. The next few days were brutal. Mom went through all the stages of grief and fast forward. Denial gave way to anger, which gave way to bargaining, which gave way to depression. She'd call him and leave these pleading voicemails asking him to call her back, to explain what was happening, to just let her know he was okay. She'd text him paragraphs about how worried she was, how she just wanted to understand. He never responded. Not once. The financial reality started sinking in around the same time as the emotional reality. Mom had always been financially comfortable but not wealthy. The house had represented the majority of her net worth. Without it, and without the money she'd given him, she was starting from scratch at an age when most people are thinking about retirement. Her apartment lease was month to month, which had seemed like a good idea when she thought she might be traveling or relocating for the business venture. Now it just meant she had no stability in rent that was eating up most of her limited income. She'd been living off the remaining proceeds from the house sale, but that money was disappearing faster than she'd anticipated. I started spending more time at her place, helping her figure out a budget and look for ways to stretch her resources. We'd sit at her small kitchen table with bills and bank statements spread out, trying to make the numbers work. She'd aged years in just a few weeks. The energy and optimism she'd had about her new chapter had been replaced by this defeated exhaustion that broke my heart. The practical stuff was manageable. We could figure out the finances, find her a more affordable place, help her apply for assistance programs if necessary. But the emotional damage felt irreparable. She built her identity around being his mother, around supporting his dreams and celebrating his successes. Now she had to confront the possibility that the person she loved most in the world had seen her as nothing more than a source of funding. Update 2. 3 months after the emails, something unexpected happened. I was at Mom's apartment helping her sort through more belongings she was planning to sell when someone knocked on the door. We weren't expecting anyone, and Mom rarely had visitors anymore. She'd become withdrawn, embarrassed about her situation, and reluctant to explain to friends and neighbors what had happened. When she opened the door, it was her neighbor from the old house, an elderly woman who'd lived next door for over 20 years. She was holding a manila envelope and looked nervous. She explained that she'd been getting Mom's mail by mistake ever since the new owners moved in. The postal service was having trouble with the forwarding, and things kept getting delivered to the old address. Most of it was junk mail that she'd just thrown away, but this envelope looked important. Inside was a letter from a law firm in Mexico. My Spanish isn't great, but I could make out enough to understand that it was some kind of legal notification. We took it to a translation service the next day, and what we learned changed everything. My brother had been arrested in Cancun on charges related to financial fraud. Not just any fraud. He'd apparently been running the same scam on multiple people, convincing them to invest in fake business opportunities and then disappearing with their money. Mom wasn't his only victim. There were at least 6 other people who'd lost their savings to his schemes. The Mexican authorities had frozen his assets and were working with U.S. law enforcement to investigate the full scope of his operation. The letter was notifying Mom as one of the identified victims and asking if she wanted to participate in recovery proceedings. Mom's reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of feeling vindicated or hopeful about potentially getting some money back, she seemed devastated all over again. Learning that his betrayal of her wasn't personal, that she was just one of several marks in a broader criminal enterprise, somehow made it worse rather than better. She thought she was special to him, that her sacrifice had meant something even if the business venture had failed. Finding out that she'd been deliberately targeted and manipulated like any other victim stripped away even that small comfort. But something else started happening over the following weeks. Other victims began reaching out through the law enforcement investigation. Mom started talking to some of them, people from different states who'd been approached with similar stories and had lost similar amounts of money. There was something therapeutic about talking to people who understood exactly what she'd been through. They compared notes about the warning signs they'd ignored, the red flags they'd rationalized away, the shame they felt about being taken in so completely. Mom started attending a support group for financial fraud victims that met at the community center near her apartment. The legal process was slow and complicated, but it gave Mom something to focus on besides her own grief and regret. She became almost obsessive about documenting everything for the attorneys, gathering old emails and text messages and bank records that might help build the case. More importantly, she started talking to me more. Really talking. Not just the surface-level check-ins we'd been doing for years, but actual conversations about feelings and fears and hopes. She told me about the guilt she carried for favoring him so obviously when we were growing up. She talked about how she justified it to herself by thinking he needed more support because he was more ambitious, more sensitive, more likely to struggle if he didn't have her encouragement. She admitted that she'd known, on some level, that her treatment of us hadn't been equal. But she convinced herself that I was more self-sufficient, that I didn't need as much attention or validation. She told herself that her favoritism was actually a form of protection, that she was helping him because he was more vulnerable, not because she loved him more. Hearing her say these things out loud was both painful and healing. I'd spent so many years wondering if I was imagining the disparity, if I was being too sensitive or demanding too much attention. Having her acknowledge it directly didn't erase the hurt, but it validated my experience in a way that felt important. The support group meetings became a regular part of our routine. I'd drive Mom there twice a week and wait in the car while she met with the other victims. Sometimes she'd come out looking drained and sad, but more often she seemed energized by the connection with people who understood her situation. One evening after a meeting, she asked if I wanted to get dinner. We went to this little diner that we'd never been to before, and she started telling me about the other people in the group. There was a retired teacher who'd lost her pension savings to a fake investment scheme. A young couple who'd been scammed out of their house down payment by someone claiming to be a real estate developer. An elderly man whose nephew had convinced him to invest in a non-existent tech startup. As she talked about their stories, I realized something was shifting in how she saw her own situation. She was starting to understand that being victimized didn't make her stupid or gullible, it made her human. The people who commit these crimes are professionals who study psychology and manipulation. They're skilled at identifying and exploiting people's hopes and vulnerabilities. Final update. The legal proceedings took almost a year to resolve. My brother eventually pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud and was sentenced to 5 years in a Mexican prison. The asset recovery process managed to return about 40% of what Mom had lost, not enough to restore her original financial position, but enough to provide some stability and breathing room. More importantly, something fundamental had changed in our relationship during that year. All those drives to support group meetings, all those evenings spent helping her navigate legal paperwork, all those conversations about feelings we'd never talked about before, they built something new between us. She started asking about my life in ways she never had before. Not just the basic facts about work and relationships, but deeper questions about what I was passionate about, what challenges I was facing, what dreams I was pursuing. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like she was genuinely curious about who I was as a person rather than just checking a box in her parental duties. The shift didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always smooth. There were moments when she'd slip back into old patterns, making comments that revealed she was still processing years of unconscious bias. There were times when I felt resentful about having to be the one to step up and support her, especially when she'd occasionally wonder aloud whether he might try to contact her when he got out of prison. But gradually, we developed something that felt like an authentic adult relationship. She started calling me not just when she needed help with something, but just to talk. She'd share funny stories from her part-time job at the library, or tell me about books she was reading, or ask for my opinion on decisions she was making. The most meaningful moment came about 18 months after everything had started. We were having dinner at my apartment. I'd been cooking for her more often, partly because her budget was still tight, but mostly because we both enjoyed the time together. She was telling me about a conversation she'd had with someone at work when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. She looked at me across the table and said she was sorry it had taken her so long to really see me. She said she'd been so focused on trying to fix what she perceived as his weaknesses that she'd failed to appreciate my strengths. She said she was proud of the man I'd become, and she was grateful that I'd stayed by her side when I could have easily walked away. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no tears or grand gestures. Just a quiet acknowledgement of something we both knew had changed. She said she wished she'd noticed me sooner, really seen who I was instead of who she thought I should be. It was too late to undo 30 years of feeling invisible, but it wasn't too late to build something better going forward. We never heard from him again after his sentencing. No letters, no phone calls, no attempts at reconciliation or apology. Mom stopped wondering out loud whether he might reach out, stopped checking his social media accounts, stopped carrying hope that he might somehow make things right. She channeled her energy into other things instead. She became a volunteer advocate for fraud victims, using her experience to help other people navigate the legal and emotional aftermath of financial crimes. She started taking classes at the community college, not for any practical purpose, just because she'd always wanted to learn more about art history and literature. Most importantly, she invested in the relationships that had proven themselves reliable. She made time for friends who'd stood by her during the crisis. She became closer with her sister, who'd always been supportive but had been kept at arm's length because of family drama involving him. And she made space in her life for the son who'd been there all along. I'm not going to pretend it was a perfect ending. The financial impact was real and lasting. She had to work longer than she'd planned, couldn't travel the way she'd hoped to in retirement, and had to be much more careful with money than she'd ever been before. The emotional scars were deep and probably permanent. She never fully trusted her own judgment again when it came to people's motives and intentions. But there was something powerful about discovering that love and loyalty could grow stronger after being tested. That relationships could deepen when they were built on choice rather than obligation or habit. That it was possible to start over at any age, even when the foundation you'd built your life on crumbled beneath you. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if losing him was actually the thing that allowed Mom and me to find each other. When he was the center of her universe, there wasn't room for anyone else to matter as much. His absence created space for other relationships to flourish. She still keeps a photo of him on her bookshelf, an old one from college, before everything went wrong. When people ask about it, she tells them matter-of-factly that she had 2 sons, and one of them broke her heart. But she doesn't dwell on it the way she used to. She's built a life that doesn't depend on his validation or presence. These days, she calls me her sunshine. Not to replace what she'd lost, but because she finally sees the light that had been there all along. It took losing everything for her to realize what she actually had. Better late than never, she says. And I agree.